topic I kind of came across maybe like 2 years ago. Started reading this book midway through my second year, and was pretty impressed at just how applicable some of the things the author talked about. A lot of things that I didn't foresee or never really thought of actually turn out to be habits that we do on a daily basis that we just don't know. And applies to everything: professional, academic habits, social, family habits, personal habits. So just something that I always thought would be great to share with you guys. A couple objectives for this talk. We'll introduce a concept called the habit loop, discuss what psychiatrists, psychologists refer to as the golden rule of habit change, introduce this notion of Keystone Habits and how they apply to habits both as individuals and as institutions. So this is early 1990s. This is a sort of academic arms race in terms of understanding how people tick, what makes us do what we do. Research is going on simultaneously both at MIT and Cambridge in the UK. MIT conducted experiments using mice, put these tiny electrodes inside their skull to record cerebral activity, put them inside this very simple maze, T-shaped maze with a piece of chocolate at one end. Mice were behind this partitioning device, and a loud clicking sound would come on, then the partition would open. The mice would meander their way through the maze, smelling the air, scratching the walls, whatever, eventually finding their way to chocolate. They would take the same mice, put them back in the maze, do it over and over again. And each time the mouse would find the chocolate faster and faster. Pretty self-explanatory, right? But this actually was really impressive. So this is what the electrode in their skull is recording. This is where the clicking sound is placed, is them running the maze, and is the end where the chocolate was found. So you'll see these spikes going up and down. And this is the first mouse to do the experiment. The same mouse over time would run the maze faster and faster. But what was interesting was, as they're running the maze, the electrode was picking up much less activity. And the faster they got, the less active their brains were. They maintained that spike in the beginning, when they heard that clicking sound, and at the end, when they found their prize. So the researchers at MIT hypothesized that there's this sort of three-step approach to developing habits. The cue, which is something that triggers our brains to know that, or identify what habit to use in a particular scenario. The routine, which is the habit itself, some type of pattern, either behavior, can be a thought, it can be an emotion, and a reward, which serves as positive reinforcement, essentially telling our brain that this habit is worth remembering for next time. This is the habit loop for the MIT experiment. Our cue, which is the clicking sound, routine, which is running the maze, and then the reward. So around the same time in Cambridge, they were doing similar studies using macaque monkeys. Also placed electrodes inside their skulls, recorded cerebral activity. This time they would place them in a room, sitting in a chair, staring at a screen. On the screen there would be projections of certain shapes and colors, and they have a lever right next to them. If they happened to pull the lever when a particular color pattern was shown, they would get grape juice that would, I guess, like shower them. Apparently they want grape juice. So this is the habit loop that the Cambridge researchers developed. Our color pattern, pulling the lever, and then our showering of grape juice.
They like that.
Julio was the first macaque that did the experiment. So the activity recorded by the electrode is a little different than the mice experiment. They didn't have the initial spike where the Q, which is the shape on the screen, but they had a similar spike at the end when they got their juice, which is the reward in the habit loop. They would take the same macaque, run the experiment over and over again. After about a week, they noticed something really interesting, and this spike, which is the reward, came much sooner. It actually preceded getting the reward itself. Over time, actually preceded the behavior. So as soon as they saw the color pattern on the screen, their brain started processing this reward, almost like Pavlov's dog, right? You hear the bell, mouth start watering, they know food is coming. Except here's an additional step where they had to perform an action. So they identified this spike early on before the reward as something that they called craving. They began to crave the juice. Makes sense, right? So they wanted to try to disrupt that association. They tried giving the macaques food, placing it in the corner so they knew they liked, trying to get them off the chair. Or they'll open the door so they can see their friends, try to tempt them to go outside and play. Before the association reached this degree, it was really easy. They would distract them, they would run off the chair, go eat, run outside and play. But once it reached this degree, once the association was strengthened to this point, nothing they could do could get the macaques off the chair. So they tried to disassociate them by diluting the juice, making it very watery. They started delaying the reward after they pulled the lever, and sometimes withholding the reward altogether. And they noticed the monkey started getting very upset, very frustrated. Sounds almost like human behavior, right? When people have addiction to certain substances or even dependence. When you withhold it or dilute it, make it a similar negative response. So based on these two experiments, this is kind of where our current understanding of habits lie. As demonstrated by the MIT experiment with the mice, our brains aren't fully functional, aren't fully participating in decision making once a habit is developed. So in other words, unless you deliberately fight a habit, the pattern's going to unfold automatically. Craving strengthens the habit loop. So, as we saw the Cambridge experiment, when that spike starts to precede the reward, even the behavior itself, now you're constantly chasing that reward because you're not getting that same sensation once we get our grape juice. Makes sense? And habits never actually go away. No matter how much time the mice spent away from the maze, when the MIT researchers put them back in their familiar settings, their familiar environment, and they heard that familiar clicking sound, they would run the maze like it was yesterday. So you guys are smart. You're probably thinking, okay, how do we know this is actually a habit that develops? How do we know the mice didn't just remember where the chocolate was? Right? That's kind of what I was thinking as I read this. This is one of the first people that actually helped further sort of our understanding of habits. Eugene is 71, pretty healthy guy, only has osteoarthritis. Came down, devastating viral encephalitis. The author isn't a has no medical background, but from what he describes, Eugene probably had HSV. Spent 10 days in a coma, woke up, had difficulty speaking, swallowing, had no memory. After about 5 weeks of rehab, all his motor functions returned, but his memory remained impaired. For some reason, there was an arbitrary time period around the last, maybe 1960-ish. So this took place in 1990s, 93. So the last 30 years, he had no memory, but everything prior to roughly 1960, he actually remembered extremely well. He could tell you how he grew up, he could tell you the time in the Marines, but he couldn't recognize his children's face, didn't know any of their names, couldn't tell you anything from the last 3 decades. When you talk to him, surprisingly normal. You can't tell there's any neurologic impairment. Can hold a normal conversation, can make you laugh, but after about 15 minutes, we'll revisit the exact same conversation verbatim. So he had anterograde amnesia, couldn't form any new memories, but also had retrograde amnesia, as we said, so about 1960-ish. All his old habits remained intact. Even though his memory was impaired, they found out he was still able to form new habits. Family moved from Northern California to San Diego because he was being followed by this researcher at UC San Diego, this neurologist, a neuroscientist that was involved in using Eugene in all these different experiments in terms of habit formation. And he didn't know his surroundings, didn't know his home, didn't know anything. So his wife couldn't let him out of her sight. So she would take him on walks once a day around their neighborhood. She would take him to all the appointments. And over time, he would be able to get up and go out on his own, walk around the block, around the neighborhood, but still find his way back. Had no idea what his address was, didn't know what his house looked like. When he sat with his researcher, he asked him to draw his neighborhood, draw his block, label any of the streets. He had no clue. He asked him to draw a map of his house, how to get from his bedroom to the bathroom. He had no idea. He had no idea what rooms were adjacent to each other. He didn't know how to get from his living room to the kitchen. But when he was hungry, he would get up, go into the kitchen, and make bacon and eggs. It was actually his favorite meal, and he would always forget he had breakfast, so he would eat bacon and eggs like 5 times a day. And if he had to use the restroom, he would get up, go to the restroom, but he would have no idea how he actually got there. So that actually, I had time to publish lots of stuff based on Eugene and sort of where habits are actually stored within our brains. So similar to rings in a tree, our brains are thought to have the more peripheral parts developed more recently in evolution. The more central parts of our brain are the more primitive parts. And that's where the current understanding of habits are thought to be stored, within the basal ganglia, which is separate from memory, which is stored in the hippocampus. So we talked a little bit about habit development, formation, and in terms of habit change, this is something that sort of psychiatrists, behavioral psychologists kind of refer to as the golden rule of how to change a habit. It goes pretty much that any habit can be changed as long as you keep the same cue and same reward. But remember, habits never really go away. So if you want to end a habit, you have to change it into something else. And the best way to do that is by keeping those old cues and delivering the old reward, but inserting a new routine. It sounds pretty simple, but what's hard about this is actually identifying our own habit loop. As we said before, most of our habits we do on a daily basis we're not aware of. So this actually takes a pretty impressive degree of getting to know yourself and understanding yourself before you're able to identify what's triggering you to do certain behaviors or think of certain things. For example, take alcoholism. Say someone's cue to drink is feeling lonely, sad, anxious. They drink alcohol as a form of solace or companionship or comfort, and that makes them feel better, or it just makes them forget about how bad they felt. So this craving for relief is what drives people to drink with alcoholism. And something that, let's take Alcoholics Anonymous, for example, is really good at doing is changing that behavior to insert something else here, which can be your AA sponsor, or someone else can be a friend, family member, significant other, which can give you that same sense of companionship. And in other words, you're keeping your same cue and reward, just inserting a different routine to replace the habit that you're trying to change. I know, it sounds really simple. One thing we notice that when we look at people who have quote-unquote bad habits, or let's say substance abuse is our example, those who are able to insert this new routine, essentially changing their habits, it's not necessarily a magic bullet, meaning over time, those same cues will always be there. And one thing they noticed was that during particularly stressful moments, people are more likely to revert back to their old habits, back to their comfort zone. It can be 6 months after your last drink or cigarette. It can be a year later. It can be when you have the death of a loved one, loss of a job, or some other tragic incident. So how do we prevent that? So now that we've formed a new habit, how do we prevent the old routine from coming back? One thing that's been shown to work, again, sounds very simple, but just believing that you can accomplish something. Having a strong sense of belief, whether it's in yourself, in some conviction, some strong sense of willpower, in someone else, some confidant, or some higher power, or if you're very religious, has been shown to be very successful at helping people refrain from reverting back to their old habits. Everyone's heard of Alcoholic Anonymous 12-step program. This is actually the first 7. And if you notice, all of them have something in common, and it's pretty much some reference to a higher power. In this case, specifically God. You don't have to be religious, but Alcoholics Anonymous encourages all of their participants to embrace something larger than themselves, something that they can rely on during those dark days to prevent them from going back to their old habits. And this is actually one of the more successful programs at ultimately changing behavior. So there are 2 types of habits. Well, there are lots of different types, but in this case, we'll keep it pretty simple. Up to this point, we kind of just talked about individual habits, but there's also habits that we have at institutions. Bless you. Institutions, so as, let's say, a residency program, as a department of emergency medicine, as a county hospital or university hospital. There are particular habits, and you probably are already thinking of some that we complain about in the ED all the time. Keystone habits are something that have potential to influence other habits. If you can change a keystone habit, this has potential to translate into a much larger change, which we'll talk about in a second. This comes from architecture. It's a masonry arc. This is the keystone, which is the apex. It's the last piece to get placed in the arc. The arc isn't self-supporting until the keystone is placed, and surprisingly, it's actually the piece that bears the least amount of weight of the entire structure. A single masonry arc you see over doorways or tunnels, bridges, not bridges, but tunnels. You can see it on the ceilings of cathedrals. You can have intersecting arcs with one center keystone. So Lisa, we'll call her, she's a 30-year-old female, overweight, been smoking and drinking for over half her life. Always struggled with employment. On her resume, the longest single employment period was less than a year. And I know most of us will probably laugh at this, but probably wish we were on it 10,000. She came home from work one day, and her husband told her he's in love with someone else and he's leaving. Spent the next several months really depressed, drinking more, eating a lot more, gaining more weight, and decided she needed a trip to take her mind off of everything. She always wanted to see the pyramids in Giza, so she decided to go to Egypt. She's on a bus on her way to the pyramids, and she's kind of gazing out over the desert, staring at the horizon, and has this epiphany. I feel like she hit rock bottom, and she needs to set a goal for herself, something she can work towards to kind of distract her from everything else going on in her life. She decides that she's going to come back to Egypt and trek through the desert one day. That's going to be her goal. But in order to accomplish that goal, she knew that she had to be physically fit. She knew she had to, first of all things, quit smoking, because she didn't think she'll make it a day in the desert. and most likely have to lose weight. She comes back from Egypt, and within 6 months, she successfully quit smoking. Fast forward about 4 years later, she's being interviewed by the author for this book, and she hasn't had a cigarette in 4 years, lost 60 pounds. Now she runs several half marathons and 1 full marathon, went back to school, got her master's, she bought a home, and at this point, she's currently engaged. Completely transformed her life. And she's now enrolled in an NIH study. I believe it's actually still ongoing. There's 25 participants, and they're just multidisciplinary team in Bethesda, kind of just trying to figure out how did they transform their lives. There's a neurologist, a psychologist, sociologist, a geneticist of all people. They're like sequencing their DNA, scanning their heads, sitting down for interviews. They have cameras in their homes trying to figure out what influenced them or how did they make this change. And for Lisa, it was smoking. This was her keystone habit. Once she was able to quit smoking, it changed the rest of her life. It translated into a much broader change. So that was one example of an individual keystone habit. So moving on to institutional habits. Paul ONeill worked as an analyst in Washington, D.C., worked for the Office of Management and Budget in the 60s and 70s. So this is well before all this habit science and research was coming out. His job as an analyst was to look at different government agencies and evaluate how much money they were budgeted, how they were spending it, what were they accomplishing, essentially how effective they were. One thing he noticed was that the most successful government agencies understood the importance of routine. The least or less successful agencies might have been led by someone who was really good at their job, but they never really thought about routines and habits and were kind of just shooting in the dark. Actually moved up the ladder really quickly, was promoted several times, made lots of friends, and I guess rubbed elbows with lots of big names in Washington. Ended up leaving in 1977 to spend more time with family. Spent like 10 years working in a small company, running like a paper company. Fast forward to 10 years, 1987, now a lot of those same friends we met in Washington, D.C. were on the executive board for this company called Alcoa. This stands for the Aluminum Company of America. At this time, they were the most successful aluminum company on the planet, had a head start by decades. The founder of Alcoa actually invented the smelting process for aluminum. But at this point, their competitors have been catching up to them, so they're losing customers. They're desperate, investing in lots of new products that were failing. So you look at the last decade or so, they were losing lots of money. So they decided they needed a change in leadership. All his buddies were there, and they called Paul ONeill. They said, listen, we need you to come in. He took over as CEO, but he knew that to change the entire company, this global company, you can't just order someone to change. You can't tell a medical student to be better, right? You can't tell someone to work faster and do a better job at the same time and expect to have a good outcome. So he knew he needed something to rally the company around. And his mantra became worker safety. He knew that's something no one can argue against, from the ground level employee to the top-notch CEO. At the time he took over as CEO, Alcoa had more than one safety incident per week globally. And when you're working with molten aluminum, these are disastrous. People are losing limbs, people are dying on the job. So his goal was to make that zero. Zero safety incidents a week. But in order to do that, in order to accomplish that goal, they revolutionized how they communicate. So this is going on before all the QL stuff that we talk about has come out to 1990s. This is going on decades before that. He wanted to know about a safety incident within 24 hours of it happening, no matter where in the world. He wanted regional managers, regional executives to contact him with a description of the event and how are they going to prevent it from happening again. In order for a regional executive to know that, they need their site executive or site directors to contact them with that information. For the site directors to know that, they need the shift managers to contact them with that information. For the shift managers to know, they need all their employees to communicate better with them. And it completely revolutionized the way they communicate as a company. Once communication improved, low-level, quote-unquote, employees were now perfectly comfortable bringing up suggestions to their managers. And new ideas started getting embraced, and it changed a lot more than just safety. So as the company got safer, they became much more profitable. One example was machines that were becoming outdated. Employees would complain, managers would just ignore them. But once Paul ONeill took over, some of these older machines started getting replaced, and they realized that they were producing a much better product. The chief component to producing subpar aluminum was that they had malfunctioning machines. So who knew? If you listen to your employees, things get better, right? It's like mind-boggling. So now they're producing better products, they're more efficient, and profits are skyrocketing. So we have an example of individual keystone habit, institutional keystone habit, which is safety, right? And these apply to our workplace, right? We have institutional habits that we institute as a program, as a department, as a hospital. Some good, some maybe not so good. And how do these work? So psychologists, psychiatrists kind of talk about this for small wins, and it's defined as a steady application of a small advantage. An example is exercise. When you're exercising, whether you're running, weight training, stretching, doing yoga, like you can see small improvements, right? The more you do it, the better you get. You slowly see yourself running a little farther each day, lifting a few extra pounds, or stretching a little bit farther. This builds momentum, this motivates, and this leads you to believe, there goes that word again, that a much larger achievement is possible. And they also develop structure for other habits to change. And this goes more to like the institutional habits. But instituting this culture of safety is what set this structure for better communication and better transfer of ideas and flow of ideas, and actually made their company, Alcoa, much better. When Paul ONeill left after 13 years, 2000, so their profits were now 5 times larger when he took over initially in '87. A couple examples of keystone habits. People who exercise regularly were shown to eat better, shown to have more patience, tend to be more productive at work. Remember, this is, you guys always hear, oh, correlation doesn't equal causation. So they don't necessarily equal each other, but we see it, and it's very common. Food journaling. This is from an ONeill study in 2009. Patients that had weekly meetings with a nutritionist and were advised to do 180 hours of exercise a week. Amounts to about 30 minutes a day. And encouraged to keep a journal of everything they're eating, what they're eating, how much, and what time. The patients who actually kept the journal, even though they went to the same nutritional meetings, they were encouraged to exercise the same amount. The people who kept the journal at 6-month follow-up lost almost twice as much weight as the people who didn't. And it's because of the structure that is set in their lives. People saw their unhealthy habits. People saw when they tend to eat fast foods. People started using this journal as a way to plan for future meals. And lastly, children who eat dinners at home with family were shown to be more diligent with homework, tend to get higher grades, better emotional control, and more confidence. Here I'll diverge really briefly, but this is a book I read freshman year of college. That kind of started this whole journey for me into medicine. Prior to this, I went to college kind of by accident, and was going to be a gym teacher, majoring in exercise science. Going to go the phys ed route, not because I was particularly passionate about it, but one of my coaches in high school was like, "Hey, I should be a gym teacher." I said, "Yeah, all right." A friend of mine read this book. For some reason, thought I would like it, and she gave it to me. And these are three guys who grew up in Newark, New Jersey, in a shithole environment, really similar to mine. Went to a terrible school. My high school was ranked 5th from the bottom in all of New Jersey public high schools. I have like 344, 45. One of the only 4 high schools that my school outperformed was theirs. But they made a pact when they were in middle school that they were all going to go on to high school. They're not going to drop out. Not going to be another statistic. They went on to college and they said, "We're going to go on to medical school." They were friends throughout, held each other accountable, and fast forward maybe a decade or so, one is now does emergency medicine, one's an internist, and one's a dentist. They came back to Newark. They started a nonprofit foundation called the Three Doctors Foundation, and they wrote a book about their experience called After the Pact that they made in middle school. So I read the book and spring break of freshman year and thought, this is almost like my life story. Similar environment, similar schools, got into a lot of the same trouble I got into growing up. And I thought, if these guys can be doctors, then maybe something I can do too. Literally changed my life. This is my brother. He's a goofball, but probably one of the smartest people I ever met. If he went to college, he'd easily be working for NASA or be like the next Elon Musk. He teaches himself everything, mechanics, engineering, physics, business, economics. He just picks up books and absorbs all this knowledge. He didn't need the whole structured academic path that I did. This is my class, end of intern orientation. And yes, that is our county chief. This is a few of us at the holiday party. Okay. So, just to summarize, to really understand what drives us to do what we do, why we behave the way we do, why we think the way we do, I actually think it takes a lot of time alone and spent trying to understand